Curious Lloyd.
Being the ghost of a murder victim must be pretty frustrating. Not only do you know for a fact who your killer is, but you also have to float around watching a bunch of people failing to put all the puzzle pieces together. So it makes a lot of sense that some of these spirits want to roll up their intangible sleeves, spit through their hands, and get to work solving their own cases. I'm not saying that ghosts are real, but I'm just saying, in the following cases, the dead were a lot more competent than the living. A haunting was allowed as evidence in a murder trial. In 1897, a West Virginia woman named Elva Shue, wife of a local blacksmith, Edward Shue, was found dead by a neighbour. She was discovered lying at the foot of some stairs, her body in an awkward pose. After a cursory examination, a local doctor deemed her death natural and proceeded with her burial, and that would have been the end of the case, except that the ghost of Elva Shue was having none of it. The reason Elva was never properly examined was that Edward methodically kept anyone from inspecting her neck and head, cradling it obsessively and becoming aggressive when the coroner came anywhere near her. Then the new widower acted strangely during the funeral process, allowing only a cursory examination of the body and keeping her neck covered in a high neck dress and scarf, which you could say is super suspicious behaviour. The doctor didn't feel right to press the issue and listed Elva's cause of death as everlasting faint and then complications of pregnancy. Elva's mother, Mary Jane Heister, hadn't liked Edward, and despite the lack of evidence, she was convinced he had murdered Elva. But given that both investigating crimes properly and taking women seriously hadn't yet been invented in 1897, Mary Jane could do nothing but pray that somehow the truth would come to light. Then, 4 nights in a row, Elva herself supposedly appeared in Mary Jane's dreams, explaining that her husband had crushed her neck because he hadn't liked his dinner. To prove that her spinal cord had been severed, Elva's ghost turned her head around 180 degrees, then walked away while staring at Mary Jane. A creepy thing to do to your mother, but at this point it seems clear that Elva wasn't messing around. Mary Jane took this revelation to the local law guy, John Preston, and we'll never know whether Preston believed her or simply wanted to get the crazy sounding woman off his back, but her panic ramblings convinced him to look into the case. After learning about Edward's strange behaviour, Preston, the only competent non-dead person in this story, ordered the body to be exhumed. It took him about 5 seconds to conclude that, indeed, Edward killed Elva. However, the strangest part of this story isn't the claims of Elva haunting her mother or twisting her neck like an owl. It's that all this ghostly nonsense held up in court. During Edward's trial, Mary Jane was allowed to testify, and while it was Shue's lawyer's intention to make her look like a crazy old lady, this backfired horribly when Mary Jane stood her ground and managed to convince the jury what she had experienced. The trial's acceptance of this ghostly evidence has led some to call it the only known case in which testimony from a ghost has helped convict a murderer, which is emblazoned on a plaque celebrating Elva Shue, who got her killer from beyond the grave. A pilot cleared his name from beyond the grave. In 1913, Royal Flying Corps Lieutenant Desmond Arthur fatally crashed his plane during a routine training exercise at an airbase in Montrose, Scotland. This did not, according to local legend, prevent Lieutenant Arthur from continuing to make appearances at the base. Soldiers began reporting mysterious footsteps and phantom plane noises, as well as seeing a ghostly figure. One pilot claimed he saw a fellow soldier in flight gear walk to the door of their mess hall, only to disappear without entering, while a flight instructor said he woke up in the middle of the night and also saw a pilot sitting in his chair by his bed. In all fairness, Arthur would have knocked, but he clearly hadn't figured out the doors quite yet. It didn't help undead Arthur's popularity that these spookouts coincided with a grave inquiry into the cause of his crash. The initial ruling was reckless on behalf of the pilot, which was bad for morale, seeing as how World War I had started and British pilots were expected to get all the way to Belgium before getting killed. But claims of ghost sightings at Montrose continued. Another man who had known Arthur said that Arthur appeared in his room and tried to speak to him, but couldn't make a sound. The story became so infamous that supposedly a German pilot who was shot down and captured behind Allied lines asked what the latest news on the ghost was. Because of these sightings, superstitious pilots started thinking there was something keeping Arthur from moving on. Eventually, a new investigation into his death commenced, which absolved Arthur of any blame. It turns out, the planes in 1913 were were kind of prone to falling apart sometimes. After his name was cleared, his ghost supposedly made a final appearance in front of his 3 old comrades, smiling at each of them before vanishing forever. Other sightings were claimed in later decades, and Arthur because of staple of Montrose law, although ghost experts, inasmuch as that's a thing, believe that these were simply other pilots who had been killed during the World Wars, and Arthur was content to stay dead after his reputation had been restored, but he was honoured with a wraith-laying ceremony on the 100th anniversary of his death, just to make sure he wouldn't have an excuse to drop in again. The infamous Red Barn murder was solved by the victim's mother. In 1827, Maria Martin and William Corder had arranged to run away. They agreed to meet at the Red Barn, a local landmark in their town in Suffolk, England. But while the 2 lovers entered, only one left. William skipped town soon after his secret meeting, but no one saw Maria leave with him. He wrote letters to her family, but made increasingly transparent excuses for why none of them were coming from Maria herself. Maybe she was sick, or maybe she had hurt her hand. The post office must have lost her letters. After a few months, Maria's stepmother began to have troubling dreams in which Maria was murdered and buried in the Red Barn. She was convinced that her daughter's spirit was drawing her to that location, and eventually, her husband agreed to search the barn to soothe his crazy wife's mind. A few shovels worth of dirt later, Maria's body was discovered. Authorities had little trouble tracking down William, who it turns out wasn't exactly a criminal mastermind and was just milling out about in London with pistols and incriminating letters tucked under his bed. In one of the biggest trials of the era, he was found guilty of brutally murdering Maria over a petty argument and was hanged for his crimes. The site of the heartless murder became a popular landmark for rubberneckers, and over time, the Red Barn was stripped clean by true crime enthusiasts looking for souvenirs. Likewise, but much more disturbingly, William was also stripped clean. His skeleton was put on display in a museum, while his skin was used to bind a book about the murder. What remains unexplained is why it took visions in a dream for people to consider what seemed like such an obvious series of events. Teresita Basa possessed the living to name her killer. This one goes back to the 1977 murder of Teresita Basa, a hospital employee who was found stripped, stabbed, and burned in a raided apartment. After weeks of investigating, the police still weren't any closer to find the killer, with only a journey entry stating, "Get tickets for AS." Then, after 6 frustrating months, detectives received a tip about another employee at Basa's hotel named Alan Showery, a man with very suspicious initials. But who came through with the tip? Teresita Basa, if you can believe it. When the police traced the call, they ended up meeting with Jose and Remy Chouard. According to Remy and Basa, Showery showed up at Basa's apartment to fix her TV, but ended up murdering her and stealing her jewelry. When asked how they knew so much about the murder, Jose claimed that on 3 occasions, his wife had been possessed by Basa, and then explained the details of the crime. Police searched Showery's apartment and found a ring and a pendant belonging to Basa. They arrested Showery, who eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 14 years. But while the case of Basa's murder was finally solved, there was still one big WTF concerning her spiritual snitching. It was quickly discovered that Remy Chouard was not, as initially acclaimed, a total stranger. She worked in the same department of the hospital as Showery and Basa, but had lost her job just hours before her first possession supposedly happened. But that doesn't explain how she knew that Showery was a killer, and investigations into that particular factor don't have many answers. The best rational guess anyone has is that she suspected Showery, but was scared of him and didn't know how to relay this information except to claim a ghost made her do it. Remy, for her part, told the jury that Basa spoke through my lips, and that all I remember hearing is the name Alan. I just felt cold and thirsty, so if somebody ever gives you chills and cotton mouth, it might just mean that a ghost is trying to tell you that they are a murderer, or you might just need some hot tea. Multiple people have confessed to murders after being haunted by their victims. We tend to think of the average murderer as a remorseless monster. However, killers can be so haunted by their actions that they are driven to confess. Some, though, take the haunting part a bit literal. In 2013, Adrian Dow confessed to the murder of Jennifer Stewart, claiming that after he committed the crime, he went for a walk and saw the ghost of his victim. Since that day, Dow claims that he started believing in God and belatedly concluded that it's not a good thing to kill someone. It's not the most inspiring religious conversion on record, but then, Dow also committed the murder because he thought it would help his rap career, so maybe he's not the best person to take life advice from. In April 2017, serial killer Terry Childs confessed to 2 murders while serving time for 3 more. Childs says he was being eaten up by his victims, Joan Mack and Christopher Hall, and no, he didn't mean in the abstract sense of overwhelming guilt. He told the police they were in his cell, staring at him and eating up his brain. The 2 new crimes he confessed to occurred in 1984 and 85, which makes these some pretty damn persistent ghosts. In January 2017, apparently a banner year for ghost-induced confessions, Jose Ferreira confessed to a 1982 crime wherein he pushed 13-year-old Carrie Ann Jopek down a stairway to her death because she refused to have sex with him. Her mother credits Jopek, rather than the police, for solving the crime because 33 years after she was killed, Ferreira claimed that the girl's spirit had been haunting him and confessed. So keep that in mind. If you ever plan to haunt someone, persistence can get you results in ways that a couple of quick jump scares never can.